Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Keat TV in Eureka, California. I'm your host, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. Please, before we get started, remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Public television can use your support. Over the past 18 months and change, this show has become a kind of existential tour bus, climbing narrow roads up and over steep hill and mountainsides to get our collective eyes on our prize, even as the landscapes have turned wondrous and strange. But what is our prize? The truth? The deepest nature of things? Those secrets that have driven humanity's long quest for the sacred and visionary? Yes. Or maybe it's merely the questioning, the conversations en route that we're after, the permission to last to remain enchanted by our lives and universe, despite materialist science and dogmatists claiming the mysteries are all solved. Yes and yes. Today's guest is James Cobban, an author and student of Jane Roberts, who decades ago inaugurated what many consider the New Age by seeming to channel a discarnate personality by the name of Seth. Over the course of many books, countless channeling sessions, and even a number of classes conducted with Seth in attendance, a corpus of material arose that is breathtaking in its clarity, deeply mystical, wholly self-consistent, and potentially transformative. In many ways, these messages are exactly what we've been looking for, a potential glimpse beyond the limited view of our senses and into what may well lie beyond. Cobban has combed through the Seth Material and produced a 2-volume synthesis that crystallizes those messages and allows for general accessibility. Beautifully written and deeply penetrating, Nursery of the Gods by James Cobban is one more prize picked up on our collective journey and one that delivers startling insights. He joins us now. Thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
To be honest, I stumbled upon your book by accident, and I was searching for James Robert Seth Material because I'd read some books by Jane, and they were fascinating, but there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of material there. And what I really, I found your books, and what I appreciate about them is that they really condense it down into a message that's easy to approach and, much more pointed than the channeling sessions and her books are, because they go right to, the questions I'm kind of asking about, the existential, ontological questions. So now typically my show is about UFOs, and I know that you took a look before we got on the show where the connections lie between what Seth has written or through Jane and the UFO topic. So can you give us a little bit of insight about what you found in terms of what Seth has to say about UFOs?
Right, sure. So Seth didn't have a lot to say about UFOs, but he did mention it a few times. So I think the most interesting things that he said are that there seem to be really two different types of phenomenon involved. One is actual physical craft and physical beings, and the other is non-physical, extra-dimensional beings or craft. So, but he says that yes, there actually have been physical visitations to our planet in physical crafts, and which I thought was interesting. And he says that he doesn't think that there will be any physical landings here, any physical contact for quite some time. But he said that 50 years ago. So
yeah, absolutely. Have you been following the UFO topic at all? And
I mean, just from time to time, as things come up, I'm always looking for evidence that supports Seth's view of reality, or anything that's that disagrees with materialism, because we've got to get away from materialism, and UFOs do fall into that category. It's just, I mean, I've been waiting my whole life for some like definitive evidence of UFOs, and I mean, maybe some would say that it has happened, but I don't know. I'm not really an expert in that field, but
it hasn't happened. I'll go ahead and put that out there. It hasn't happened. There's a lot of evidence and there's a lot of testimony, and but that smoking gun thing is what we're all kind of waiting for.
All that testimony in Congress and whatnot, but. Anyway, Seth says that there has been visitors in the past. He even said that in some ancient cultures, remnants of crafts were used in the people's temples. So they've found and utilized actual bits of material. And he says that there have even been experiments performed on humans where aliens have actually visited our planet and tried to, always with the aim of improving our species in some way, not in in any dark way of trying to take us over or something like that. But he says most of the time, though, by the time the technical difficulties of space travel are worked out or are getting close to being worked out, civilizations have reached a high enough psychic degree of capability that it's no longer necessary to travel physically, and it's far easier just to travel mentally, just a projection of consciousness. So that's also what happens a lot, and probably most of the time. And that's also how the extra-dimensional travelers visit us. So part of Seth's philosophy or theory is that there are various other fields of reality, other reality systems. Some are more or less physical and similar to ours, but others are very different. So if a traveler is starting off in their home field, their own reality, which may have atoms and molecules, but their structure will be different from ours. So as they enter our reality, a distortion begins to occur, and the atoms and molecules that make up their craft, or it could be a projection of their own consciousness, but their own native reality state has to change to conform to ours, because this says that there's a tremendous pressure to conform to the local, what he calls camouflage of any given reality system. So as you enter our system, says the craft are caught literally between two worlds, and there's a tremendous pressure to do one thing or the other. So people witnessing those things, what they're seeing is something between a donkey and a horse, but neither. They're seeing something betwixt and between our realities. Yeah. And so the crafts will try to retain what they can of their own native form and change what they must. And sometimes what they retain will seem bizarre to us. So there may be, if they shoot off at right angles, for instance, that's them retaining functions that are native to their own reality system. And so different people might perceive different aspects too, because they're not really physical in some of these cases. They're impressions from another dimension. They're taking on some of our reality. So people may perceive different aspects.
And that definitely happens. I mean, some people will, in a group of people, some people will see it, some people won't. Some people will see a light, while some people will see a physical craft. I mean, it's fascinating how that ranges,
So now Seth would say that we each create our own reality. And so inside our own conscious experience, you may perceive the glowing lights, while I might see something solid or not glowing or shooting off at right angles. So there's that too. We're not all living in exactly the same reality, even in physical terms, because according to Seth, there is no objectively existing physical reality that just exists out there and would still exist if you and I weren't here, or if there were no consciousness anywhere in the universe. That's the materialist concept of reality.
Yeah.
Where there's a distinct universe out there made up of physical stuff. But Seth says, no, that's not the case. We each live in our own consciousness-based reality that looks physical to us. But so your UFO won't be the same as my UFO, and like your computer won't even look the same to me as it does to you, because all of our realities are just slightly different based on our own consciousness.
Which is really, I mean, sort of the kind of a window into the deeper metaphysics of Seth, right? I mean, the whole nature of how, individuality forms, how souls are part of this greater all that is. Um, but before we go into that, because I want to get into that part of it, I wanted to get sort of your personal story of how you discovered Jane Roberts and Seth. And I think you mentioned that you met Jane Roberts. Is that right?
I did. Yeah, when I was 17 years old.
Hmm.
So I'd stumbled across the Seth Speaks, one of the first Seth books. I had just been at my school's library at lunchtime. I was 14, and I just happened to pick up that book, and it just blew me away. All the ideas in it just seemed so natural to me. It just seemed really right.
Yeah.
I could relate to it. I wasn't from a religious family. The closest we came to anything strange was my dad had an interest in Edgar Casey. So I had read one or two books about Casey. So to that extent, I was sort of open to, unorthodox ideas or unofficial views of reality. But when I read the Seth Material, it's like the floodgates opened, and it was like this flood of information. But it all seemed familiar to me too. It seemed like going home somehow. It just
Yeah.
really resonated with me. And I knew that I wanted to meet Jane Roberts. Because to me, she was like a rock star.
Yeah.
But for me, I wanted to meet her because I knew she was going to be important. I knew that this material was so good that it just had to be important.
Yeah.
And so my dad had started reading material because I was so interested in it. And I convinced him to drive us down to Elmira, New York, to meet with her. I lived in Toronto, Canada at the time, so it was about a 4-hour drive.
Yeah.
So, one snowy December day, we drove down there, and we knocked on her door, and her husband, Rob Butts, opened the door, and we didn't know it, but it was their 27th wedding anniversary that day.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was bad timing. I mean, I'm sure, meeting strangers from out of town was the last thing that they wanted to do on their 27th wedding anniversary. But Rob said, look, let me go and check with Jane. He did, and he came back and said, yeah, Jane would like to meet you. I think she felt sorry for us for driving from a different country. And I realized that Toronto was only a 4-hour drive. And it also might have been because I was 17 and she had a soft spot, I think, for young people. So did Seth. He liked talking to young people. He said, the young are always great searchers after truth. And I think that's true. Young people are just more open. They're not as inured to the belief systems of our society.
Yeah.
So anyway, we went in, and Jane was sitting at her table. Another thing I didn't realize at the time was just how physically ill Jane was. She had a really bad form of rheumatoid arthritis, and it would actually kill her less than 4 years after I met her. I found out later, though, that a lot of really gifted psychics and mediums have this kind of rheumatoid arthritis. Just something, maybe it's got something to do with the way their chemical changes in their brain when they're communicating with other beings.
Do you know what type of arthritis it is, or is there a name for it that you know?
Yeah, it's the rheumatoid arthritis.
Okay.
So it's I don't know much about it on that, but it just seizes you up, and so it didn't occur to me at the time, but Jane never left the table the whole time I was there. Not when I went in, and not when I got up to leave. But think about it at the time.
Yeah.
So I got to meet her, and we didn't talk about anything very profound. I just told her how much I, thought how impressed I was with what she was doing with the material.
Yeah.
She told me one silly little story about the she had a big abalone shell that she was using as an ashtray.
Mhm.
She was a chain smoker, so it was full of Pall Mall cigarette butts. So she told me one day she was on vacation with Rob, her husband, in Baja, California, and they met a hermit there who lived in a cave. And all he wanted to do was show them his prized possession in the cave. And it was a washing machine, but it was an electrical washing machine. And he didn't have electricity. That's what Jane found so amusing was that, the contrast between the pride in owning such an advanced, sophisticated thing. This would have been the 1950s probably, but not having electricity to run it. So anyway.
Says something about human nature and our culture a little bit,
Imperialist acquisition, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where she got the abalone shell, was from the beach in front of his cave.
Yeah.
And I left after that, and I don't think I made any impression on her. I was just a kid. Later, I found out that her diary entry for that day was one little line. A man and his son drove down from Canada to visit us. That was the extent of the impression I made on.
Well, at least you made it in the books, that's cool. Or diary.
Yeah.
So you went from reading the book as I imagine a casual teenage, approach to reading it, and you were wowed by it. Your knowledge that you display in Nursery of the Gods is thorough and academic. Like you've spent years studying this material. Can we talk about how you got to that point and what role the Seth Material played in helping you form your own perspective on spirituality and reality and all those sorts of things?
Well, it's really been a constant in my life. It's really guided my whole life, and I've tried to live by it as much as I can. Its basic message is you create your own reality based on your own beliefs. So, and also that part of the reason for us being here is that this is a training system of sorts for emerging consciousnesses. And the purpose is to try and learn to use your own consciousness more effectively, and to basically to try to make fewer mistakes over time, and try and make your life more purposeful. Try and have it reflect more of the things you want to include, and fewer of the things that you don't want. And it's really tough. It's not easy. Even Seth said, this is a very difficult thing to do. And that's why you need to have training systems like this. It's not easy. So it's also why we have to have compassion for everyone. Sorry. But yeah, I knew that I would want to be studying this material for my whole life. And it then takes a lifetime because there's a lot of it.
There's so much, yeah.
So much. Seth spoke through Jane twice a week for more than 20 years. And there's more than 4 million words of material and 8,000 pages. So, it's a lot to absorb. So it took me, really my whole life. I'm still learning about it now. Whenever I reread a section, I'll get new insights. It's sometimes like encountering it for the first time, and a lot of other people say the same thing. It's just so deep. But I knew that if it was true, if any of it was true, then there would have to be evidence for it. Like it should show up here and there. There should be, science should be able to, if not prove it, there should be indications of it. Even though science is based on materialism, so science isn't trying to prove any of the ideas in Seth Material, but things that are anomalous to science, that science just can't figure out how to deal with, those tend to be the things that do support the Seth Material.
and more as we go along. I mean, like the higher we get in the sciences, and I mean, I kind of, there's this whole thing that happens in this subject where people kind of, when they can't explain something, they throw out quantum physics, and they're like, yeah, well, that's quantum physics. And a lot of times it's from a naive or uninformed perspective. Your books aren't that, and you delineate lots of cases where there seem to be coming together, where what he describes or what he is revealing through Jane is becoming more and more the subject of what scientists are finding in their laboratories, which is
Yeah,
cool.
there's a lot, and it's from different fields. There's parapsychologists. They've been doing experiments for more than a century now, all of which support Seth's ideas that consciousness is the fundamental basis of reality. So, I mean, we can say now that things like telepathy are proven, things like remote viewing are proven. Even skeptics of psi, if they're intellectually honest, like there's a thing called Richard Wiseman, severe critic of all things psi, but even he admitted that remote viewing is proven. If it was any other branch of science, it would just be considered proven. The evidence is so strong. And there's evidence for that with telepathy and clairvoyance, and then there's near-death experience research.
Absolutely.
There's so much of that, so many consistent stories. And they delineate a kind of reality that Seth described, an inner dimension of reality where time and space don't exist. The absence of time is a really weird one. Seth always insisted that in inner reality, all things are happening at once, all time is simultaneous.
Yeah.
Which is just impossible to get your
to conceive of. Yeah, absolutely.
We can't. I can't.
Well, and when I was reading Seth's books, what really struck me about that, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the idea of like reincarnation or other lives, having sort of other individualities that we've occupied, and we think of that sequentially, right? Like, in the past I was this person or that person, but they're all happening simultaneously. So they're ongoing in a way, in a now, but it's not something that we experience that way, so we can't conceive or describe it. It's strange.
Well, it is strange, but and yet the people who have undergone near-death experiences, they all come back and say, when I was dead, the thing that struck me, the biggest absence there was the absence of time. There was no time. They said everything was happening at once, and yet it all made sense. There was no confusion. The confusion only happened later when they were resuscitated and they were trying to explain their experience to people, because they said there's just no way that they could put that experience into our words, because our words are strung out linearly in time based on the concept of time. So, but anyway, that's another one of Seth's core ideas that is getting borne out. Oh, and then quantum physics also insists that there's a no-time dimension. Yeah. It propped up with entanglement and non-locality.
Yeah.
Einstein was a staunch materialist at heart, and he didn't think quantum physics was correct at all. And he thought he had found a fatal flaw in quantum physics, because he knew that it said that entangled particles they form when you can entangle two particles in such a way that if one particle has, say, upward spin, the other one will have downward spin. I don't know much about up and down spin of physics, but that's what physicists call it. So
it's described that way.
So, but that means that if you take a measurement on one of those entangled particles and find that it has upward spin, the other entangled particle will instantly collapse. They call it the collapse of the wave function when you make an observation. And it will be found to have the opposite spin. So Einstein's thought experiment, which he hoped would just annihilate quantum mechanics altogether, he said, okay, let's take two entangled particles and we'll let them drift apart at the speed of light, any arbitrary distance. And then we'll take a reading on one of the particles, and that will collapse its wave function. What that means is before a particle is observed, it's said to exist in something called a quantum superposition of states, where it's and so it's all possible states that a photon or electron can be in all at once. It's every place and going at every speed and direction at once. But when you make an observation, you only see one of those. So it collapses all this vast possibility space where all those different probable versions exist. They collapse into one specific particle, and then you see that particle. So if a physicist decides to observe a particle that's entangled, the quantum physics predicts that the other particle of the entangled pair will simultaneously, right at that moment, also collapse and collapse in a specific way so that it'll have the opposite spin. And Einstein felt that that should be impossible because what could cause the second particle to collapse? I mean, the first particle, okay, the physicist is observing it. It's landing on a screen or something, he can see it. But what if the other particle is 10 light years away? Like what is causing that to collapse? Because and how could it collapse instantly? Because what could reach it? Everything is supposed to be limited to the speed of light. So if it's 10 light years away, it should take 10 years for any signal to reach it. And yet, when they actually carried out this experiment, it took 5 decades for technology to improve, but they carried it out, and Einstein was disproven, and quantum mechanics was proven. So something made the second particle collapse, and so they call that non-local realm of reality. And time's not involved and space isn't involved because it happens instantaneously. So that finding made the concept of at least one other dimension of reality both necessary and acceptable. It is in fact the case that there is more to reality than just the 3 dimensions of space and one of time. And I think that makes it more credible that entities like Seth could exist. And it really should be taken more seriously. I think materialists have done a great job of discrediting the whole idea of the possibility of entities like Seth being able to exist, because it's very threatening to the paradigm of materialism. So they had to they belittle it, and they just call it woo-woo and whatnot. And, but now the evidence that they've tried to sweep under the carpet for a century, but now there's so much of it that people are falling over the lumps in the carpet, and I don't think it can go on for much longer. I think some of the people you've had on your show actually have said that, at least privately, even scientists are starting to say, there's more to it than materialism. We just can't come out and say so right now because we need funding.
You're exactly right. And the institutions are all, part of that materialist edifice that won't flex. And hopefully over time that'll change. That's part of what I'm trying to do in the show. And we talked a little bit about in the email. Folks like you and myself are trying to make the argument that reconsidering those notions, the time has come for that. And you mentioned quantum physics and non-locality and entanglement. All those things are true. And like you look at the double slit experiment, where a particle goes through and it acts both as a wave and as a particle, depending on who's observing it. And those like consciousness basically changes the outcome of an experiment in a way that we can't explain. And we still have not dealt with that. Like, I think as a culture, we've basically heard that and we know it's true, and we design technology based on it, but we haven't really taken it in and understood that that says something very fundamental about the universe, you know?
Well, I think that also shows just how strong the materialist, the mindset, or really the mythology, because I think it's a mythology as much as anything else is a mythology. It's a mythology based on the idea that everything is made of matter, even consciousness, because the materialism, of course, consciousness has to arise from matter. For it to make sense, for materialism to make sense, then consciousness also has to arise from matter. No one's ever been able to propose a mechanism for how that could occur, so that's why it's the hard problem. But the persistence of this myth, it just shows you how strong these things are. Once they take hold, they're really, it's a paradigm really. And a paradigm is really hard to get rid of. Because they can't be changed one step at a time, incrementally. They have to be overthrown. There has to be, you have to completely dispense with one and take another one up. So it requires a tipping point, and we just haven't reached that tipping point yet, even though it seems like we're getting closer.
Say that again. I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
I think that when it does happen, it'll happen quickly, all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. We have this notion as a human species of linear progress, that everything we've done is an improvement upon the past. And so therefore, the idea that we want to go back and rethink materialism, basically for a lot of folks, it seems like retrograde. Like they don't want to go backwards. That's to the reign of the church or those sort of dogmatists, but they don't realize that they've become just as dogmatic in their beliefs and their faith as the Catholic Church was, in medieval times. It's just the places have been swapped, and authority is what drives that, and they have all the authority,
I mean, in fact, biologist Rupert Sheldrake points out that the science is as rigid and orthodox as the church. In fact, even more so, because the Catholic Church broke down in the 1500s. Catholic means universal, so since then you've got Protestantism and even Church of Satan or atheists, but there's still just one science, there's one materialism, and every scientist in the world has to agree to its tenets, its axioms. Mm-hmm. And if he doesn't, he or she is going to lose their job. It's as simple as that. You can't speak out against the tenets of materialism and still be accepted as a member of the scientific community. So that makes it very difficult for science to change. I've thought that in many ways scientists are prisoners of their...
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like some of the conversations I've had where people are willing to talk about it privately, but not willing to, it's like, because they don't want to put their reputations or their money at risk. And so they are living in some sort of bondage, unable to have free thinking, ideas, because if they do, it'll be at the sacrifice of their career.
That's right. Yeah. Rupert Sheldrake mentioned that when he goes to talks, the scientists come up to him afterwards, and they're all very excited and very eager to talk about telepathy or whatever he's been talking about. And he says, "Why don't you just do it yourself? You'd have so much more fun doing telepathy instead of whatever field they're in." And that's one thing that I would like to see is for experts in different fields to just start thinking about their field in these new ways, in a consciousness-based way. That's part of what I was hoping to do with my book. Was I tried to show that there are a lot of different fields that actually do use a lot of these ideas. Complexity science has some, and of course quantum physics, and all the parapsychologists and cardiologists who study near-death experiences. There's all sorts of different areas of interest that are converging on the same sorts of ideas. And it's always that consciousness and not matter is the basis of reality.
Well, and that's, I mean, could you describe Seth's Material as PanPsychist? Is that the word you'd use? Or basically everything is conscious in some form?
Yes, I mean, Seth does say that, but there may be differences between panpsychism and Seth's views. I don't actually know enough about panpsychism to really comment.
Yeah.
Seth would say, though, that even atoms possess consciousness to some minute degree, because he says energy itself is conscious, and atoms are made of energy.
Everything is made of energy. So there we are. That's the answer right there, right? And it gets around that hard problem, because if you combine matter, which is supposed to be dead, and no matter how big or intricate the pile, it's still going to be dead matter. But if there's consciousness in there, then that could lead to something else, right?
Right, because if consciousness was there to begin with, then there's no point at which consciousness arises from dead matter. There was no dead matter to begin with. Just in simpler formations, consciousness can't really show itself. I mean, if you've just got one atom, that doesn't give consciousness much to work with. But if you combine a lot of atoms, trillions of atoms together into molecules and cells and whatnot, then you can, emergence takes over. And the more complex the physical structure, the more consciousness, and the more it can show itself. Seth refers to it as an accelerated form of consciousness can emerge from more complicated structures like the human brain, for instance. But even then, Seth says it's not the complicatedness of the structure that allows for the consciousness. The consciousness came first, and it requires a more complex consciousness to enter into and animate those more complicated structures like animal brains or something like that. But yeah, still, every atom does to some degree possess consciousness.
It's interesting what in your book you point out that Seth talks about the universe as a thought, as mind. Much more than as like a matter-based universe. I have a quote here I want to read from your book. So if you don't mind, let me pull it up, and I will edit this pause out so it'll be nice and elegant when we are on the air. This is the one. Yes. Okay. So this is from your book. You're talking about ontological primitives, which are the sort of the base assumptions people make when they're formulating their views of what's real and their philosophical systems. Quote, in philosophical jargon, the most fundamental elements of any system are called its ontological primitives, and they are the ground or base upon which a system of thought is founded. In Seth's philosophical system, those primitives are not material objects like quarks or electrons or vibrating strings, but mental elements like consciousness and identity. Seth's ontological primitives are not quantities that can be measured, but qualities that can be experienced. At the most fundamental level, all that is mental and experiential in nature, not physical or material. A great thought, as the physicist James Jeans put it, not a great machine.
That's right. And note that even the physicists are saying that. I mean, so yeah. That's when I found that quote by that James Jean fellow, that amazed me, because it's exactly what Seth is saying. And here's a quantum physicist saying exactly that.
Yeah. And that's an idea. I mean, that whole idea is not just Seth. I mean, there have been mystics throughout history. And in fact, one of the things I've been doing is sort of reading up on people who have had these concepts of what the universe is, what God is, what we are, and kind of comparing systems. And like Dion Fortune, she's an occultist from decades past, and she wrote a book called The Cosmic Doctrine, which sort of lays out a lot of these things. Plotinus, the ancient Greek philosopher, he wrote the Enneads, and although I've never read the Enneads, I've read books about the Enneads because it's famously murky and hard to follow. But both of those folks describe something very similar to what Seth is talking about. And so there's consistency across multiple sources as to what people are, and for Plotinus and for Dion Fortune, a lot of that is experiential, not necessarily channeling someone who gave them that information, but it's the same truth gets revealed, which I think leads to its credibility,
Yeah, and it would make sense too that other people would be experiencing the same things and coming to the same conclusions. I mean, if Seth is right, then there should be a lot of people experiencing or approaching these sorts of ideas, and there are.
There are,
and
yeah.
Ancient traditions always speak of an inner reality that's similar to what these mystics are saying. It's only recently that our mythologies have changed and adopted a more outward focus. I mean, all of the old Neolithic traditions, they saw humans as part of the great web of life. And death was just moving through a veil. People would move back and forth in both directions between an inner reality, an inner domain, and physical reality. And they didn't see themselves as distinct from any of it. They were part of it, along with the spirits of rain and water and the animals. But it was only with materialism. That was around the time that our new mythology of matter sprang up. I talk about that in my second volume, where Seth says that part of the training system, our involvement with the training system, is that on a species level, we've tried to develop what he calls an ego identity. And by that he means an identity, a conscious identity that tries to set itself apart from energy and all of nature, all of inner reality, and see itself as a distinct entity all on its own. He said he gives various reasons for this, and it's interesting to me. But what I wanted to do then was to go back through mythology and see if I could find evidence for a shift, a focus from an ego the absence of an ego. So just a conscious identity, a human that felt part of nature. Of course, they did. And then to see how it progressed through the millennia as our mythology shifted and we migrated to our current mythology of materialism. But materialism is actually a perfect mythology for an ego that sees itself set apart from nature and apart from any inner reality.
Absolutely.
And in fact, denies the existence of an inner reality and sees itself as so separate from the rest of the universe that it considers itself an epiphenomenon. That's how. So, in a way, I understand how we came to materialism. But Seth is right, and it's part of an experiment that our species has undertaken to develop this independent psychological platform that he calls an ego. Then we would have to get to materialism at some point. But he says we've taken the experiment far enough in one direction. The outward-looking part of the experiment has come to its logical conclusion now and is going to kill the Earth if we continue on.
If we continue doing it, yeah.
The next phase, if we're to survive as a species, is to start looking inwards once again. And that's what you're saying. We're hinting at in the idea of people not wanting to go back to previous religions.
Yeah.
That's sort of going backwards. And that's not what Seth is talking about. There's no need to go back to the Neolithic earth goddess. But to reimagine our connection with an inner domain, but in a new way. And without getting rid of the ego. We don't need to sacrifice the ego on the altar of nirvana or something. We can take it with us, but look with these new eyes and with this new focus turn it inwards. We could have science explore, instead of exploring outward reality, they could explore inner reality. And some scientists, the parapsychologists, are trying to do that, but there's not very many of them, and they don't get much funding.
Exactly, and that's the eternal problem here. For folks who are new to Seth, can we talk a little about some general questions real quick? Like, I mean, for the individual soul, if you're embodied and you have a soul and you die, what happens according to Seth?
According to Seth, you're still you when you die, so that doesn't go away. It never goes away. There's never any fear of annihilation. He says you're eternally inviolate. You can never be extinguished. Your consciousness will always be, and it will always be developing. So you'll continue to exist, but you won't always continue to exist as you are right now. No more than the child that you once were. It hasn't gone away. It's still within you. But you're much more than the child that you were. But your sense of identity hasn't changed. It's continuous. So the same thing happens after death. You still are you, and there are teachers to explain the situation, and you can continue your education either in different non-physical areas of reality, or you can choose to be reincarnated.
Here, back to the earth, right? Yep. And it's an interesting story of Seth's own story, which he kind of reveals at times about who he is. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, he is kind of apart from it now as someone who sort of helps people evolve or helps souls evolve, right?
Yeah, he's so Seth. The Seth personality, he actually describes it as kind of a bridge personality between what he is in his own reality and what he appears as when he spoke to Jane Roberts. Jane Roberts herself contributed to that bridge personality, Seth says. So
yeah,
kind of united, their consciousness would mingle. And Seth, in order to communicate with Jane, Seth borrowed reincarnational personalities of his own, simply because they were close to physical reality. They had been physical. They understood what it means to be a physical creature, and in fact had been involved in lives with Jane Roberts in those previous existences. He mentioned one in Denmark in the 1600s.
And in fact, he referred to Jane by a male name from someone that he'd known, right?
Well, he calls Jane Rubert.
Rubert, yeah.
But Rubert wasn't a reincarnational name, but the name Jane's entity, which you could think of an entity as a soul. It's sort of the larger being that Jane Roberts is a fragment of.
Yeah.
So that was a male entity, or I mean, just as there aren't any male or female entities, but the characteristics that we would call male in conventional terms would apply more to that entity. So he gave it the male name Rubert. But Jane was involved with Seth in several different lifetimes. And it was that connection that enabled Seth to make contact with Jane in this or in that lifetime, in the 20th century lifetime as a mystic. And because at some deep level, they both stem from the same entity.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's interesting.
That's what he said. Yeah. So, in fact, so Seth says that what he is represents what Jane is growing towards, and in some unimaginable amount of time, Seth is what Jane will turn into. But by that time, Seth will himself be something else, and then it becomes difficult to follow, because from our three-dimensional standpoint, we can't really get a grip on identities mixing and matching. So this idea of a soul or entity involves more than one physical incarnation. So
Yeah, there's fragments, right? Like, I mean, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
So the soul, your soul, includes all of your different reincarnational selves. Now they're also you, but obviously they're also not you. So you become aware of them after you die, and so and then it all makes sense to you, and you're able to embrace that sort of greater personhood. Because we eventually have to move past the idea of one soul, one body, because it's not really meted out that way, that there's one soul to one body. It's just consciousness taking on different forms at different times. And even in your current instantiation as a physical being, your ego personality is itself composed of more than one personality, more like a sub-personality. These have been referred to as alters by one of your guests, and they're split personalities. They're called, but they actually exist. There was an experiment, or not an experiment, but there's something called a split brain syndrome.
Yeah.
And that's where the corpus callosum is severed. And that's the bundle of nerve fibers that unites the two hemispheres of the brain.
Yeah.
And that surgery is done sometimes in cases of severe epilepsy. And when it's done, though, the two hemispheres start to exhibit different personalities that are normally united by the corpus callosum. When that's severed, they start acting out on their own. And in one famous case, a patient would try and pull his pants down continuously with one hand, while the other hand tried grabbing them and pulling his pants back up.
That's awkward.
The patient reached out to slap his wife across the face, and the other hand would have to grab the misbehaving hand to intervene. So there are definitely different levels of personality that are integrated normally in a human. And so we don't notice that we're made up of at least two different personalities. And Seth would say that even the organs in your body act as sub-wholes, and to some extent they have a personality. And right down to the level of the cells, every single cell, being conscious to some extent, has a personality, and it contributes to the makeup of what you are. So in the same way, that's the analogy holds with cells. So it says that a soul is a group of cells comes together to form a soul, in the same way that a group of cells comes together to form a human body. And they integrate seamlessly, but so you still have independence as you in your soul, the same way that you could remove a cell from your body and put it in a petri dish, and it would still be alive. It would still have its own independent existence as itself.
Yeah.
But it forms in the greater whole or gestalt of your body.
Now, one of the things, sorry, about souls, I mean, one of the things that people resist the idea of, there being spirits and souls for human beings is that, like, one argument is that, well, human beings aren't special, that we're just a part of the biosphere or whatever, and that religion teaches us that we're exceptional God's creatures, and that, but according to Seth's, configuration or thinking, everything is ensouled, right? Like, I mean, animals are ensouled, and you talk about atoms even having an amount of soul. So it's all part of this, like, cycle of evolution that's going on, and smaller and smaller, or bigger and bigger portions of spirit, right?
That's right. Yeah, everything has a spirit, or you could just say that everything is spirit.
Yeah.
Right now, we're just spirit taking on flesh. We're just embodied in what Seth would call the camouflage of physical existence. We're just camouflaged in physical atoms, but those atoms themselves are formations of consciousness. So it's just consciousness playing with itself. It's just action acting upon action. So that's what I say. Action is this term for energy and everything else, really. It's everything that exists is action. And so, yes, everything has a soul. Cats, dogs, everything. And he says that we humans have also passed through all of those stages. He says we have spent aeons traveling through the cosmos as little particles, not realizing who we were, and we slowly become more conscious of what we are and of our potentials. And we're still doing that right now. We're still pretty junior, Seth says, in the scheme of things, but we've advanced a tremendous amount since we were. He says that we have all spent time as all of the cells that make up our body, so different kinds of cells and organ systems. We've all had to go through stages where we found out what it's like to organize ourselves into a cell or an amoeba. We've been through these different levels of reality, and now we're humans. And so we won't reincarnate as dogs or amoebas again. That's behind us, and we don't need to do that anymore.
Because our consciousness has reached a certain level, right? So we keep going up or whatever. Yeah.
And eventually we won't need to reincarnate as physical beings at all. We get to progress to other systems that he says are less limited and closer to what we would conventionally call God. That's why I call my book Nursery of the Gods, because nothing to do with the Christian God, but that's an accepted term for the greater realities we're talking about. And Seth says that we will one day be a portion of the gods that we may now pray to. It will be a fully conscious portion. So we're evolving in that direction, but there's no end to it. Even the gods are evolving. All that is itself is evolving, and there's no end point. All that is doesn't even know what it's evolving towards.
Yeah, it's a process. It's something that's ongoing, an evolutionary movement that never ends, and it just kind of goes through itself. And it seems, at least from our perspective, inexhaustible. And it seems magical. And like you were saying, to me, it resonates. It's one of those things where it has power in its simplicity, and it seems like something almost you're coming back to or learning again, like it's something somehow familiar. I love it. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And there can't be an end to it, because any end or any perfection would be the death of it. It would be the annihilation of it, because it would presuppose a point beyond which no further growth would be either possible or meaningful. And that would be a dead end, a dead universe. So there just is no end. So the concept of infinity is involved, just as it's involved in the concept of spacious time or simultaneous time, the no-time environment. Because in that environment, beginnings and endings don't make any sense. They don't have any reality. If there's no time, there can't be a beginning. And there also can't be an end. So everything's just happening at once, and everything's in a state of becoming, but not becoming perfect, just becoming more itself. Yeah. And it spirals into ever greater self-awareness and greater and more complex gestalts of consciousness that we now think of as gods, but one day they'll just be you and I. We seem like gods to the cells of our body, I think, or to the atoms that make us up. They're part of us, but they're not they're not aware on our level. And so we're growing and they're growing. Everything's just developing and there's no end. It's infinite.
One thing that I enjoy about this particular conception is that it doesn't exclude virtually anything. Like if you talk about other entities or beings, or I mean, people talk about like planetary forces of astrology, of what do they call it? Oh man, there's a term and I want to remember it, and I'll have to edit this out. But um, archetypal astrology is what I interviewed a guy about it, and basically, um, the personalities of the gods are actually sort of energetic streams that move through the universe and kind of bring different things, influence our environment and other environments to sort of, you know, I don't know, they impact the universe, and that level of personality gestalt can be under the system just like anything else. It's all possible, and it's all different forms of consciousness. That was a kind of belabored way of saying it, but one question I have for you, and I don't know that I read it in the books, and maybe I missed it or whatever, but is there an ultimate personality? Is there a like when I was a kid, I used to watch Voltron, and all the robots would come together and they'd form this gigantic robot that was like really, really badass. Is there a godhead? And I mean, beyond the process, and does it have personality? Is there a self-aware consciousness that is God?
So I mean, it's yes and no, but the yes, there is, and Seth refers to that as all that is.
Yeah.
So the no part is that you're included in all that is. So you're part of that God. But yeah, there is this what he calls all that is, and all that is, he says, it's not a personality as we would think of it, and it's not a personality like the Christian God.
Yeah.
But Seth says it's almost impossible to describe it in human terms.
Sure.
He says it's all been simplified for him. So to describe it, simplify it even further, is really difficult. So, but I think what we can get from Seth is that, yeah, there is something out there, and it's trying to express itself as much as possible. It wants to be. Basically, its goal, its overriding drive is simply to be, as opposed to not being. It wants to express itself in every possible conformation of consciousness that it can. And it is conscious. It is consciousness. You could call it consciousness that exists prior to any of its manifestations or identities. It's consciousness that's in some pure form. Seth says that there was a dilemma, though, originally, that confronted all that is. He says there's something called non-being. He says there is non-being. He says it's not a state of nothingness, but it's a state where all the possibilities of existence were known and understood, the potentials of them understood, but all that is couldn't express them. There was no reality to express them into. Everything that existed in the mind of all that is. And all that is had thoughts, and those thoughts turned into distinct personalities of individuals. And they grew and clamored for their own release, but all that is didn't know how to release them. This is sort of a creation story of Seth's.
Yeah.
He doesn't mean it in literal terms, he says, but this is as close as he can get to describing what it might have been like. And he says it was a state of agony, because he says, imagine if you held in your conscious awareness all the great works of art throughout all history, every sculpture, every great painting. They throbbed as realities within you, and you could see them and sense them. But you didn't have any paint. There was no rock or pigment to create any of these. And yet you knew that they could exist. You just couldn't give them the existence that they wanted. So individuals were like them in this state of non-being. And then eventually, all that is worked out how to create reality systems like our own, like physical reality. And so it was able to send portions of itself to experience physical reality. And that's what we are. And other portions are experiencing other reality systems. And we're all part of all that is, or since we're all part of God. But we're all fragments of all that is. So we all carry within us the same attributes and characteristics of all that is, of the original. So we're like tiny seedlings or godlings growing in a little nursery. And
Nursery of the gods.
Yeah, we're in the nursery of the gods.
Yeah. I love it, man. I think we're at time, and that's a great place to end it. One question I did have for you, I wanted to follow up on something you'd said earlier, before we even had our interview. You mentioned that you wrote the book for the Seth community, or people that are really into Seth. What is there a number of people who gather? Where can people go if they wanted to have these conversations with folks and learn more about Seth, or is there a place they can do that?
Yeah, they can go to a Facebook group called the Seth House.
Okay.
That's run by a woman called Oshara, and she has formed a nonprofit and bought the house that Jane Roberts lived in when she delivered the Seth Material and all the Seth books.
Yeah.
So that's now it's going to be a museum and a place of a study. It's a library there, and people are welcome to visit. And she has a Facebook group. You can find it on Facebook called the Seth House.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I mean, not many people outside of the Seth community are even aware of my book because, it's not too many people are even aware of Seth. Or maybe they are, but they were more in the old days.
Yeah. It seems like for some folks it's a psychic curiosity or something, but it's really current. Like, I mean, as much as we're growing in terms of where we're talking about, the discussions we're having and other folks are having, everything he talks about is happening now in terms of people's realization.
Sort of coming into its own now. I think that it was kind of ahead of its time in a way. It spawned the New Age movement, or at least most people attribute the birth of the New Age movement to Seth, but the New Age movement didn't really investigate the deep ideas very much. I don't think it was more superficial, maybe you could say, and maybe it had to be that way. The culture had to catch up to those ideas to start really investigating them. So I love to see that the ideas are resonating more and more with different aspects of our culture.
Yeah. One last thing I'll mention, Peter Skafish, who is a doctor of anthropology, and he's with Gary Nolan, who is a Stanford scientist. He is the head of the Soul Foundation, which is basically a think tank and investment seeking operation surrounding UFOs and UAPs. They basically want to fund science and do research and write white papers based on UFOs and stuff. He wrote a book about Jane Roberts and Seth. Yeah, and it's a fascinating book. It's called, where is it at here? I can look on here. I should know this. I was just looking at it earlier today, but I want to tell you this in case you wanted to check it out. But it's called Rough Metaphysics, The Speculative Thought and Mediumship of Jane Roberts. And yeah, and this premise is basically like real wisdom and fascinating insights and whole philosophical systems are coming through these anomalous experiences that we typically as a society discredit. And so he uses Jane Roberts' work and the Seth Material as a leaping off point to sort of demonstrate how advanced and important that work can be. So
that's excellent. I will check that out. I'm excited to anytime I see Seth or Jane Roberts, and being picked up by any other part of our culture is terrific. And I hope one day it'll become mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, sir. Well, thank you very much.